When they cornered Seraphina Blackthorne in the abandoned Cathedral of Valehaven, the crimson-cloaked inquisitors thought they had finally captured the most wanted heretic in the realm, but what they discovered beneath her legendary obsidian armor would shatter everything they believed about power, protection, and the true meaning of strength. This is the story of a woman who became a living weapon, not through magic or divine blessing, but through something far more terrifying and beautiful than her enemies could ever imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain hammered against the cracked stained glass windows of the Cathedral of Forgotten Saints, each droplet creating a symphony of desperation that seemed to echo Seraphina's own heartbeat. She pressed her back against the cold stone altar, her breathing ragged after 3 days of relentless pursuit through the whispering woods. The obsidian armor that had protected her through countless battles now felt heavier than ever, its dark surface reflecting the flickering candlelight like a mirror made of midnight. Her pursuers had been methodical, patient, and utterly ruthless. The Order of the Crimson Veil had tracked her across half the continent, following whispers and rumors of the woman who dared to challenge their divine authority. They called her the Iron Maiden, a title that had once filled her with pride, but now felt like a curse weighing down her shoulders. For months, she had been their most elusive target, always one step ahead, always slipping through their fingers like smoke. But even smoke can be contained if you know how to trap it. The cathedral doors exploded inward with a thunderous crash that sent ancient dust cascading from the vaulted ceiling. Through the swirling debris emerged 12 figures cloaked in crimson, their faces hidden behind masks of polished silver that reflected nothing but cold determination. At their head walked Inquisitor Magnus Blackwood, a man whose reputation for extracting confessions was matched only by his creativity in dispensing punishment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Seraphina Blackthorne, his voice echoed through the sacred space like a death knell, each syllable carefully measured and weighted with authority. By the order of the High Sanctum and in the name of the Divine Codex, you are hereby charged with heresy, sedition, and the corruption of innocent souls. Surrender now, and your death will be swift. Seraphina straightened slowly, her hand instinctively moving to the hilt of her sword, Soul Render. The weapon had been her companion for over a decade, its blade forged from meteoric steel and tempered in the fires of Mount Infernus. But as her fingers closed around the familiar grip, she felt the weight of inevitability settling over her like a shroud. Surrender, she laughed, the sound bitter and sharp as winter wind. To the same order that burned my village, that murdered my family while they slept, that turns children into weapons and calls it divine will. Her voice rose with each word filling the cathedral with righteous fury. I'd rather dance with demons in the depths of the abyss. The inquisitors began to advance in perfect synchronization, their movements fluid and practiced. They had done this countless times before, cornering their prey in sacred spaces where the divine was supposed to offer protection. But the gods, Seraphina had learned long ago, were either absent or simply didn't care about the suffering of mortals. Remove her armor, Blackwood commanded, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Let us see what manner of creature hides beneath that blasphemous shell. Strip away her protection, and we strip away her power. The words sent a chill down Seraphina's spine that had nothing to do with the cold stone at her back. They didn't just want to capture her, they wanted to humiliate her, to reduce her to something weak and vulnerable before they ended her life. It was their way, she knew, to break the spirit before destroying the body. As the crimson-cloaked figures closed in around her, forming a circle of judgment in the house of forgotten gods, Seraphina closed her eyes and touched the small scar above her heart. It was barely visible, a thin white line that most would dismiss as a childhood accident. But she knew the truth. She had always known, even when she tried to forget, even when she convinced herself that the armor made her strong. The real power had been sleeping beneath her skin all along. The pursuit had begun 6 months earlier in the prosperous trading city of Golden Haven, where Seraphina had made the fatal mistake of showing mercy to a child. The boy, no more than 12 winters old, had been marked for purification by the Order, a euphemism for the brutal process of turning gifted children into mindless servants of the Divine Codex. His crime had been simple, the ability to see glimpses of the future in his dreams, a talent that the Order viewed as either diabolic influence or divine blessing, depending on whether the child submitted to their control. Seraphina had been passing through the city on her way to the northern kingdoms when she witnessed the boy's capture. She should have kept walking, should have minded her own business as she had trained herself to do over the years. But something in the child's terrified screams reminded her of her younger brother's voice on that terrible night when her own village burned. Before she could stop herself, she had drawn soul render and cut down 3 inquisitors in broad daylight. The boy had escaped into the crowd, but Seraphina's face had been seen. Within hours, wanted posters bearing her likeness were nailed to every post and pillar in the city. The order had a name for her within a day, the Iron Maiden, the heretic who dared to interfere with divine will while hiding behind black armor like a coward. What followed was a game of cat and mouse that stretched across the realm. Seraphina had always been skilled at disappearing, at blending into crowds and slipping away before trouble could find her. But the Order had resources she couldn't match, scrying pools that could track her movements, trained bloodhounds that could follow her scent across vast distances, and a network of informants in every town and village. The chase had taken her through the merchants' quarter of Silver Peak, where she had fought a running battle across rooftops, while civilians scattered like startled birds below. She had escaped through the sewers, emerging 3 miles outside the city walls covered in filth but alive. The Order had been forced to burn half a district to hide the evidence of their failure. From there the pursuit had led through the Thornwood Marshes, where Seraphina had used the treacherous terrain to her advantage. She had laid false trails, doubled back on her own path, and even managed to capture 2 inquisitors and leave them tied to trees as a message. But for every small victory, the net had grown tighter around her. The breaking point had come at the village of Millhaven, a small farming community where Seraphina had hoped to rest and resupply. She had been careful, had changed her appearance and hidden her armor beneath a traveling merchant's cloak. But the Order had anticipated her need for supplies, had already questioned every merchant and innkeeper within 100 miles. The trap had been beautifully simple. They had spread word that a plague was coming to Millhaven, encouraging the villagers to seek shelter in the cathedral. When Seraphina arrived, she found the streets empty and an eerie silence hanging over the settlement like a burial shroud. By then it was too late to retreat. The Order had surrounded the village, turning it into a prison with walls of steel and divine authority. But Seraphina had refused to be caged. She had fought her way through 24 inquisitors, her blade singing its deadly song as she carved a path toward freedom. The battle had raged through the night, turning the peaceful village into a war zone of broken bodies and burning buildings. In the end, she had been forced to flee into the Whispering Woods, leaving behind a trail of carnage that would haunt her dreams. The woods had offered temporary sanctuary, but even the ancient trees couldn't hide her forever. The Order had brought in their most skilled trackers, men and women who could read the forest like an open book. They had followed her deeper into the wilderness, always staying just far enough behind to avoid another direct confrontation, but close enough to ensure she couldn't rest. For 3 days and 3 nights, Seraphina had pushed herself beyond the limits of human endurance. She had drunk from streams tainted with her own blood, had eaten bark and bitter roots to stave off hunger, had snatched moments of sleep while standing upright against tree trunks. The armor that had once been her salvation had become her curse, its weight dragging her down with every step. When she had finally stumbled into the Cathedral of Forgotten Saints, she had known it was the end. The building stood alone in a clearing where no trees grew, its broken spires reaching toward a sky that offered no hope of escape. It was a place where desperate souls came to die, and Seraphina had accepted that she would join their number. But as she faced the crimson circle closing around her, she felt something stirring beneath her skin that had nothing to do with desperation or fear. It was something older, something that had been waiting for this moment since the day she had first drawn breath. The hunt was about to become a slaughter, but not in the way the Order expected. The obsidian armor that had earned Seraphina her fearsome reputation had not been forged in any mortal smithy. It had been a gift from her mentor, Master Aldrich Ravenwood, on the day she had completed her training at the hidden academy known as the Shadow Forge. The armor was said to be crafted from the tears of fallen stars, tempered in dragon fire, and blessed by spirits of the ancient world. It had never failed to turn aside sword or arrow, had never shown so much as a scratch despite years of brutal combat. But the true story of Seraphina's protection lay not in the mystical properties of her armor, but in the circumstances of her birth and the terrible price her mother had paid to ensure her daughter's survival. Seraphina had been born during the night of crimson stars, when 3 blood-red comets had streaked across the sky in perfect alignment. The village midwife had declared it an omen of great significance, though whether for good or ill remained unclear. What was certain was that Seraphina's mother, Elena Blackthorne, had died giving birth under those crimson lights, her final words a whispered prayer in a language that none who heard it could understand. Elena had been no ordinary village woman. She had come to the settlement of Ravenshallow 7 months pregnant, claiming to be a widow fleeing political turmoil in the eastern kingdoms. But the old women of the village had whispered among themselves about the strange scars that covered her arms, markings that looked less like battle wounds and more like ritualistic symbols carved into flesh. The truth was far more extraordinary and terrifying than any village gossip could have imagined. Elena Blackthorne had been a member of the Circle of the Eternal Flame, a secret society of scholars and mystics who had dedicated their lives to preserving forbidden knowledge from the age before the Divine Codex. She had been one of their most promising researchers, specializing in the ancient art of flesh weaving, the ability to alter living tissue at the most fundamental level. When the Order of the Crimson Veil had discovered the Circle's existence, they had launched a systematic campaign of extermination that had lasted 3 bloody years. Elena had watched her friends and colleagues burned at the stake, had seen their research destroyed, and their discoveries branded as heretical. But she had managed to escape with something more precious than any written knowledge. She had carried within her womb a child that had been changed in ways that defied both nature and divine law. The process had been Elena's masterwork, a fusion of ancient techniques and desperate innovation. Using her own body as a laboratory, she had altered her unborn daughter's cellular structure, weaving protective capabilities into every fiber of muscle, bone, and skin. It was a technique that required the mother to sacrifice her own life force, channeling it into the child during the moment of birth. Seraphina had grown up unaware of her true nature, raised by her father and older brother in the simple life of farming folk. The changes her mother had made were dormant, waiting for a catalyst that might never come. She had lived 17 normal years, showing no sign of the extraordinary gifts that lay sleeping in her blood. The catalyst had come in the form of fire and death on a night when the Order had finally tracked down the last remnants of Elena's family. They had surrounded the village at midnight, setting buildings ablaze and slaughtering anyone who tried to flee. Seraphina had watched her father cut down while defending their home, had seen her brother's throat opened by an inquisitor's blade. In that moment of ultimate trauma and loss, something had awakened inside her. The dormant changes her mother had woven into her very being had suddenly activated, flooding her system with capabilities that no human should possess. Her skin had hardened like living steel, her strength had multiplied tenfold, and her reflexes had become faster than thought itself. She had killed 12 inquisitors that night with nothing but her bare hands, her fingernails extending into razor-sharp claws that could tear through armor and bone alike. When the surviving members of the Order had finally retreated, they had left behind a scene of such carnage that the official reports blamed it on a demon manifestation. Seraphina had fled the burning village in shock and horror, not understanding what had happened to her or what she had become. It was only years later, when she had found Master Aldrich and learned to control her abilities, that she had begun to piece together the truth about her heritage. The armor had been a gift, but also a necessity, not to protect her from external threats, but to protect the world from her. When her emotions ran high, when rage or fear threatened to overwhelm her control, her skin would begin to change. It would take on a metallic sheen, would become harder than the finest steel, would generate enough heat to burn anything that touched it. The Order had spent months hunting the Iron Maiden, never realizing that the armor they sought to strip away was nothing more than a shell containing something far more dangerous. They had been chasing a legend, a story of mystical protection and divine defiance, when the reality was something that would have sent them fleeing in terror. Now as the crimson-cloaked figures closed in around her in the cathedral, Seraphina felt the familiar stirring beneath her skin that signaled the awakening of her true nature. The armor that had hidden her secret for so long was about to become irrelevant. Her mother's final gift was about to reveal itself in all its terrible glory. Inquisitor Magnus Blackwood had built his reputation on understanding his enemies better than they understood themselves. Over 2 decades of service to the Order of the Crimson Veil, he had hunted down more heretics than any other member of the Divine Council. His methods were precise, calculated, and utterly without mercy. He studied his targets like a scholar studying ancient texts, learning their weaknesses, their fears, their desperate hopes for salvation. The Iron Maiden had proven to be his most challenging quarry, a puzzle that had consumed his thoughts for months. Unlike the usual rabble of hedge witches and false prophets that crossed his path, this woman fought with skill and intelligence that suggested formal training. Her armor was clearly of supernatural origin, and her combat abilities bordered on the inhuman. But every mystery had a solution, and Blackwood prided himself on finding the key that would unlock even the most complex secrets. Standing in the cathedral with his 11 most trusted subordinates, Blackwood felt the familiar thrill of victory approaching. The building itself was perfect for his purposes, isolated, consecrated ground that would prevent any demonic intervention, and filled with the kind of divine symbolism that would break the spirit of even the most defiant heretic. The cracked stained glass windows depicted scenes of divine judgment, while the altar behind Seraphina was carved with warnings about the fate of those who defied the codex. "Surround her completely," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of divine mandate. "Remember, we need her alive for questioning. The High Sanctum wants to know where she acquired that armor and who trained her. There may be others like her hiding in the shadows." The Inquisitors moved with practiced efficiency, their crimson cloaks rustling like the wings of great predatory birds. Each carried weapons blessed by the High Sanctum, swords that could cut through magical protection, crossbows loaded with bolts inscribed with binding runes, and nets woven from silver wire that would hold even supernatural creatures. They had come prepared for a dangerous opponent, but Blackwood was confident that preparation would be enough. "Tell me, heretic," Blackwood called out as his forces took their positions, "do you feel the weight of divine displeasure settling upon you? This is sacred ground, blessed and purified according to the ancient rites. Your borrowed power cannot protect you here." Seraphina remained silent, her hand still resting on her sword hilt. But Blackwood noticed something in her posture that struck him as odd. She didn't appear frightened or desperate like most cornered prey. Instead, there was something almost contemplative about her stance, as if she were listening to a voice that only she could hear. "Search the building," Blackwood ordered 2 of his subordinates. "Look for hidden passages or prepared escape routes. She's had time to prepare defenses." The Inquisitors split off to examine the cathedral's darker corners, their footsteps echoing through the vast space. Blackwood had spent weeks analyzing every known encounter with the Iron Maiden, looking for patterns that might reveal her vulnerabilities. Her fighting style suggested training from one of the forbidden academies that had supposedly been destroyed during the Great Purification. Her equipment was clearly of otherworldly origin, possibly acquired through demonic pacts or ancient treasure hoards. But it was her psychological profile that interested him most. Every witness account mentioned the same details. She only fought when cornered or when protecting others. She showed mercy to defeated enemies. She went out of her way to avoid civilian casualties. These were not the behaviors of a hardened criminal or demonic cultist. They suggested someone driven by misguided principles rather than pure malice. "You have an interesting reputation," Blackwood continued, beginning the verbal probing that was as much a part of his method. "The Iron Maiden, they call you, a woman who hides behind steel and strikes from shadows. But witnesses describe acts of mercy, moments of hesitation that cost you tactical advantages. That suggests a conscience, which means you can be reasoned with." He gestured to his remaining forces, and they began to close the circle, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid triggering a desperate attack. "I've studied the reports from Golden Haven, from Silver Peak, from Millhaven. You fight to protect others, not for personal gain. That's admirable, in its way. Misguided but admirable." Seraphina finally spoke, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's acoustics. "Admirable. You hunt children, and call it divine will. You burn families and claim its purification. If that's what the gods want, then perhaps the gods deserve to be defied." "Blasphemy," one of the younger inquisitors hissed, raising his blessed sword. But Blackwood held up a hand to stop him. "No, let her speak. I want to understand the depths of her corruption." He studied Seraphina's face, looking for signs of the madness that usually accompanied such extreme heretical beliefs.
Instead he saw only determined sanity, which was somehow more unsettling than raving lunacy would have been. "The child in Golden Haven," Blackwood said, changing tactics. "The boy with the cursed visions. Do you know what became of him after you interfered with his purification?" Seraphina's grip tightened on her sword, and Blackwood smiled. He had found a pressure point. "He lasted 3 weeks on the streets before the visions drove him mad. We found him in an alley, having clawed his own eyes out in an attempt to stop seeing futures he couldn't prevent. He died screaming about floods of blood and burning skies. Your mercy condemned him to a far worse fate than our purification would have provided." The words were partially true. The boy had indeed died, though not quite as dramatically as Blackwood described. But truth was less important than psychological impact when dealing with heretics. The goal was to break their spirit, to make them question the righteousness of their cause. "You see, this is why the order exists," Blackwood continued, pressing his advantage. "Left unchecked, supernatural abilities consume those who possess them. We provide structure, purpose, control. Without us, gifted children become monsters or madmen. Your interference disrupts the natural order." But instead of the guilt and self-doubt he expected to see, Blackwood noticed something else in Seraphina's expression. Her eyes had taken on a strange quality, as if she were looking through him, rather than at him. More unsettling still, the temperature in the cathedral seemed to be rising, despite the cold rain battering the windows. "Remove her armor," he commanded, deciding that further conversation was pointless. "Whatever protection she thinks she has, it ends now."
The first inquisitor to reach Seraphina moved with the confidence of a man who had disarmed countless heretics before her. However, Matthias had served the order for 15 years, and his hands were steady as he reached for the clasps that held her obsidian breastplate in place. He had expected resistance, perhaps a desperate attempt to draw her sword or a futile struggle against inevitable capture. What he hadn't expected was the complete stillness with which she allowed him to approach. "Interesting," Blackwood murmured from his position at the edge of the circle. No final desperate gambit, no plea for mercy or bargain for freedom. Perhaps the Iron Maiden's reputation has been somewhat exaggerated. Matthias's fingers found the first clasp, an intricate mechanism wrought from the same dark metal as the armor itself. The moment he touched it, he jerked his hand back with a sharp intake of breath. The metal was hot, not burning hot, but warm enough to be uncomfortable, like touching a pot that had been sitting near a fire. "Sir," he called over his shoulder, "the armor is warm. Unusually warm." "Probably some kind of minor enchantment," Blackwood replied dismissively. "Use the blessed gauntlets if necessary. We've dealt with heated armor before." Matthias nodded and pulled on thick leather gloves that had been soaked in holy water and inscribed with protective runes. When he touched the clasp again, the warmth was still noticeable but no longer uncomfortable. The mechanism opened with a soft click that seemed to echo through the cathedral like a death knell. The breastplate came away in 2 pieces, revealing a simple white tunic beneath. But as the armor fell to the stone floor with a resonant clang, something extraordinary happened. The temperature in the cathedral spiked noticeably, and several of the inquisitors took involuntary steps backward as heat radiated from Seraphina's now exposed form. "Continue," Blackwood ordered, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. "Remove all of it." The gauntlets came next, revealing hands that seemed normal except for an almost imperceptible metallic sheen to the skin. Then the arm guards, the leg plates, the boots. Each piece of armor that fell away seemed to increase the heat emanating from Seraphina's body. By the time the last piece clattered to the floor, the temperature in the cathedral had risen enough that condensation was forming on the cold stone walls. Seraphina stood in nothing but her simple tunic and leggings, apparently defenseless but somehow more intimidating than she had been in full armor. Her skin had taken on a subtle luminescence, as if lit from within by some internal fire. More unsettling still, she seemed completely unaffected by the cold that had moments before been seeping through the cathedral's broken windows. "Now we see the truth," Blackwood declared, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Strip away the mystical protection, and what remains? The trasper perception but perk, if you are been subinterred." Just another frightened woman trying to seem more powerful than she actually is. But even as he spoke the words, Blackwood knew they weren't true. The heat continued to build, and he could see his subordinates growing increasingly uncomfortable. Several were sweating profusely despite the cold night air, and one of the younger inquisitors was loosening his heavy cloak. "The heat," Brother Matthias reported, his voice tight with concern. "It's not natural, sir, and it's getting stronger." Serafina finally raised her head to look directly at Blackwood, and what he saw in her eyes made his blood run cold. There was no fear there, no desperation or defeat. Instead, he saw something that looked almost like pity, as if she were looking at a child who had just made a terrible mistake. "You wanted to see what lay beneath the armor," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the heated air. "You wanted to strip away my protection, to leave me vulnerable and weak. But you never understood what the armor was really for." She raised her hands, and Blackwood saw the skin there beginning to change. What had been a subtle metallic sheen was becoming more pronounced, the flesh taking on the appearance of burnished bronze. But it wasn't just the color that was changing, the texture itself was shifting, hardening, becoming something that was no longer entirely human. "The armor wasn't there to protect me from you," Serafina continued, her voice taking on a resonant quality that seemed to vibrate through the stone itself. "It was there to protect you from me." The transformation was accelerating now, spreading up her arms and across her torso. Where moments before there had been vulnerable flesh, now there was something that looked like living metal. Her skin had become a surface of polished steel that reflected the cathedral's candlelight like a mirror, but beneath that metallic surface, deeper fires seemed to burn. "Impossible," Blackwood breathed, but his training kicked in, even as his mind reeled from what he was witnessing. "It's a demon, she's been possessed by a demon. Use the binding nets, the blessed weapons." Two inquisitors rushed forward, casting silver nets that should have wrapped around Serafina and held her fast. Instead, the nets struck her transformed skin and burst into flames, the blessed silver melting like ice in a forge. The inquisitors themselves cried out and stumbled backward as waves of heat struck them like physical blows. "Not a demon," Serafina said, and now her voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "Something far older, something your order tried to destroy but never truly understood." She took a step forward, and her bare feet left glowing impressions in the stone floor. The ancient rock actually softened under her touch, flowing like clay around the shape of her feet before cooling into permanent scars. "My mother was Elena Blackthorn of the Circle of the Eternal Flame," she continued, advancing slowly but relentlessly toward the retreating inquisitors. "She was a flesh weaver, a student of the deepest mysteries of life and death. And with her final breath, she gave me something that no armor could ever match." The transformation was complete now. Serafina stood before them as a figure out of legend, her entire body covered in what appeared to be living steel that pulsed with inner fire. Steam rose from her form where the cold air touched her superheated skin, creating an aura of mist and shadow that made her seem even more otherworldly. "She gave me skin stronger than any steel," Serafina said, her transformed features terrible and beautiful in the flickering light. "She made me into something that your blessed weapons cannot touch, that your holy ground cannot constrain, that your divine authority cannot command." Blackwood fumbled for his blessed sword, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the hilt. Around him, his subordinates were in full retreat, some throwing down their weapons and fleeing toward the cathedral's entrance. The hunt was over, but the slaughter was just beginning. The moment Serafina's transformation completed, the very air in the cathedral seemed to change its fundamental nature. What had been the cold, sterile atmosphere of abandoned sanctity became something alive and electric, charged with power that made every inquisitor's skin crawl with instinctive terror. The ancient stones of the building itself appeared to respond to her presence, taking on a faint luminescence that had nothing to do with the scattered candles or moonlight filtering through broken windows. Serafina lifted her hand to examine her transformed fingers, watching as the metallic surface rippled and flowed like liquid mercury while maintaining the hardness of forged steel. Each digit had become a work of art that no mortal smith could have created, perfectly formed, beautifully proportioned, and capable of crushing stone to powder, or slicing through blessed armor, as if it were parchment. Fascinating, she murmured, her voice now carrying undertones that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard it. I've spent so many years hiding from this, suppressing it, pretending it didn't exist. But there's something liberating about finally letting go of the pretense. Brother Matthias, who had been the first to touch her armor, found himself pressed against the cathedral wall with nowhere else to retreat. His blessed sword trembled in his grip as he watched Seraphina test her new capabilities, flexing her fingers, and watching how the metallic skin responded to her movements. When she noticed his terrified stare, she turned toward him with something that might have been a smile. "You were so eager to strip away my armor," she said, taking a single step in his direction. Where her foot touched the stone, the ancient rock softened and flowed around her heel like warm wax. "Did you think you were revealing weakness, making me vulnerable?" She reached out with one transformed hand and touched the blessed sword that Matthias held between them like a talisman. The consecrated steel, which should have been proof against any supernatural influence, began to glow cherry red at the point of contact. Within seconds, the metal was hot enough to burn, and Matthias was forced to drop the weapon with a cry of pain. "The old ways," Seraphina continued, her transformed features reflecting the light of the overheated sword, as it melted into a puddle of slag on the cathedral floor. "Blessed weapons, holy ground, divine authority, all of it meaningless when confronted with something that predates your order by millennia." Inquisitor Blackwood had managed to rally 3 of his subordinates near the altar, their faces pale but their weapons still drawn. His analytical mind was working furiously, trying to process what he was witnessing and fit it into the framework of known supernatural phenomena. Demonic possession could be exorcised, divine corruption could be purified, dark magic could be dispelled with the proper rituals. But this was something else entirely. "What are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking with strain. "What manner of abomination has corrupted your flesh?" Seraphina turned toward him, her movements fluid and graceful despite the obvious weight and power of her transformed body. The metallic skin caught and reflected the cathedral's dim light in ways that seemed to defy natural law, creating patterns of illumination that hurt to look at directly. "Abomination," she repeated, and there was genuine sadness in her inhuman voice. "Is that what you call the work of a mother who sacrificed everything to protect her child?" Elena Blackthorne was one of the greatest flesh weavers who ever lived, a woman who understood the deepest mysteries of life and death. "What she did to me wasn't corruption, it was evolution." She began to walk toward Blackwood and his remaining men, her footsteps leaving glowing impressions in the stone that would probably remain visible for centuries to come. With each step the temperature in the cathedral rose another degree, until the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat distortion. "The circle of the eternal flame didn't practice dark magic," she continued, her transformed features becoming clearer as she drew closer. Despite the metallic nature of her skin, her face remained recognizably human, though touched with an alien beauty that was both captivating and terrifying. They were scholars, researchers, students of the fundamental forces that govern existence itself. They learned to reshape flesh and bone, to alter the very building blocks of life. One of Blackwood's subordinates, a young inquisitor named Brother Marcus, made the mistake of meeting her eyes directly. What he saw there sent him into a panic so complete that he dropped his blessed crossbow and fled toward the cathedral's entrance, sobbing with terror. Seraphina watched him go with what might have been regret. "Your order destroyed them all," she said, returning her attention to Blackwood. "Burned their libraries, scattered their research, murdered every man, woman, and child who carried their knowledge. You called it purification, claimed they were demon worshippers and dark cultists. But the truth was simpler and more threatening. They had learned to surpass the limitations of mortal flesh." She paused about 10 feet away from the remaining inquisitors, close enough that they could feel the heat radiating from her body like standing too close to a blacksmith's forge. The metal of their weapons was already beginning to warm uncomfortably in their hands. "My mother knew the order was coming for her," Seraphina continued, her voice taking on the rhythm of a story told in front of a fire. "She had perhaps a day's warning,
maybe less. Not enough time to flee, not enough time to prepare proper defenses, but just enough time for one final working, one last act of love and desperation. The transformation of her skin was continuing, becoming more detailed and refined with each passing moment. What had initially appeared to be simple metallic coating was revealing itself to be something far more complex, layers of different materials woven together at the cellular level, creating a living armor that was both beautiful and terrifyingly functional. She used her own life force as the binding agent, Serafina explained, reaching up to touch her face with wonder. Channeled every remaining spark of her existence into changing my unborn body at the deepest possible level. It took her 3 days to die, and with every heartbeat, every breath, every moment of pain, she was weaving protection into my very bones. Blackwood's hand tightened on his blessed sword, but he could already see that the metal was beginning to soften where his palm gripped the hilt. The divine blessings that should have protected him from supernatural influence were proving utterly useless against this woman who had become something beyond the Order's understanding. "The armor you stripped away," Serafina said, gesturing to the pile of obsidian plates scattered across the cathedral floor, "was never my real protection. It was a shell, a cocoon, a way to contain what my mother had made me until the time came to emerge." She smiled then, an expression that was both beautiful and terrible on her transformed features, and that time is now. The cathedral's ancient architecture had witnessed centuries of prayer, confession, and divine judgment, but nothing in its long history had prepared it for the supernatural forces now being unleashed within its walls. The very stones seemed to groan under the pressure of Serafina's transformed presence, while the air itself became thick and oppressive, laden with heat that made breathing difficult for the surviving inquisitors. Blackwood found himself in the impossible position of being a predator who had suddenly discovered his prey was actually an apex predator that had been playing with him all along. His decades of training, his carefully honed instincts, his absolute faith in the Order's divine mandate, all of it crumbled in the face of something that operated outside every framework he understood. "Impossible," he whispered, though even as he spoke the word, he knew it was useless denial. The evidence of his sin was overwhelming, undeniable. The Divine Codex speaks of such things as myths, legends created to frighten the faithful. Serafina's laugh was like the sound of silver bells being forged in a celestial smithy, beautiful, musical, and utterly inhuman. The Codex was written by men who feared what they couldn't control, who needed to reduce the infinite complexity of existence to simple rules they could understand. But reality is far stranger and more wonderful than your limited imagination allows. She gestured toward the cathedral's cracked stained glass windows, where the colored light seemed to bend and flow around her transformed form. "Look around you, Inquisitor. This place was built to honor mysteries that your Order has spent centuries trying to destroy. The original architects understood that there are forces in the world that cannot be contained by doctrine or defeated by blessed weapons." The two remaining subordinates flanking Blackwood were showing clear signs of panic. Brother Aldwin, a veteran of countless purification campaigns, was sweating so profusely that his crimson robes were soaked through. His companion, Sister Morgana, had begun muttering prayers under her breath, but the sacred words seemed to die in the superheated air before they could take effect. "You're stalling," Blackwood accused, though his voice lacked conviction. "Building up your power, preparing some kind of supernatural assault, but I've faced demons before, fought entities that claimed godlike abilities. In the end they all fall to properly blessed steel and unwavering faith." To demonstrate his point, he raised his consecrated sword and spoke a word of power that should have surrounded the blade with holy fire. Instead, the weapon simply grew uncomfortably warm in his hands, the divine energies dissipating harmlessly against whatever force Serafina had become. "I'm not stalling," she replied, beginning to circle the small group like a predator toying with wounded prey. "I'm grieving. For 6 months you've hunted me across half the continent. You've destroyed innocent lives, burned villages, terrorized children, all in pursuit of someone you didn't understand and couldn't hope to defeat." Her footsteps left glowing impressions in the stone floor, creating a circle of light around the trapped inquisitors. And now, when I could end this pursuit in seconds, when I could reduce you all to ash with a thought, I find myself hesitating. Because killing you won't bring back the village boy who died in that alley, won't restore the families you've torn apart in my name. Brother Aldwin's nerve finally broke completely. With a strangled cry, he threw down his weapons and ran for the cathedral's entrance, his footsteps echoing through the vast space. But as he reached the massive doors, they slammed shut with a sound like thunder, sealing themselves with some force beyond his ability to overcome. "No one leaves," Serafina said softly, her voice carrying easily across the cathedral despite its gentle tone. "Not until this is finished. Not until accounts are settled." Sister Morgana raised her blessed crossbow with trembling hands, loading a bolt inscribed with purification runes that had cost the Order a fortune to create. "Stay back, demon. In the name of the Divine Codex, I cast you out." The bolt flew straight and true, striking Serafina directly in the chest. For a moment there was silence as everyone in the cathedral held their breath, waiting to see if the blessed weapon would have any effect. Then the projectile simply melted against her metallic skin, the purification runes flaring briefly before being consumed by the heat radiating from her body. "Not a demon," Serafina repeated patiently, as if explaining a simple concept to a confused child. "Something far older, far more fundamental. Your order's classifications are like trying to describe the ocean by examining a single drop of water." She raised her hand, and Sister Morgana's crossbow began to glow red-hot in her grip. The Inquisitor was forced to drop it with a cry of pain, her blessed weapon clattering uselessly to the stone floor, where it continued to radiate enough heat to distort the air around it. "You want to know what I am?" Serafina asked, her transformed features reflecting the light of the overheated weapons like a mirror made of living metal. "I am the culmination of knowledge your order spent centuries trying to destroy. I am flesh and steel made one, mortality and eternity united in ways that your limited minds cannot comprehend." She gestured toward the pile of obsidian armor scattered across the cathedral floor. "That shell you were so eager to strip away was crafted by Master Aldrich Ravenwood, one of the last survivors of your great purification. He spent 40 years learning to forge metal that could contain the heat of my transformed body, that could channel and focus the power my mother had woven into my very bones." The temperature in the cathedral had risen to the point where the wooden pews were beginning to smoke, their ancient timber drying out and approaching the point of spontaneous combustion. The surviving inquisitors were gasping for breath in air that felt like standing inside a furnace. "But even the finest armor is just a shell," Serafina continued, her voice taking on the cadence of prophecy. "And eventually, every shell must crack to reveal what lies beneath. You wanted to see me vulnerable, stripped of protection, reduced to something weak and human." She smiled then, an expression of terrible beauty on her inhuman features. "Congratulations, Inquisitor Blackwood, you've succeeded beyond your wildest dreams."
The moment of reckoning arrived, not with dramatic proclamations or threats of vengeance, but with the simple, terrible elegance of natural force unleashed. Serafina stood in the center of the cathedral, like a living statue cast from the finest metals, her transformed body radiating power that made the air itself seem to burn. The surviving inquisitors, Blackwood, Sister Morgana, and Brother Aldwin, found themselves trapped in a circle of their own making, surrounded by superheated stone and sealed doors that no mortal strength could breach. 23 years ago, Serafina began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute judgment. "Your order came to my village in the dead of night. They carried torches and blessed weapons, documents signed by the High Sanctum declaring my family enemies of divine will. Do you know what our crime was, Inquisitor?" Blackwood tried to speak, but the superheated air seemed to steal the words from his throat. His blessed armor, which had protected him through countless battles against supernatural foes, was becoming a prison of overheated metal that burned his skin with every movement. "We had a garden," Serafina continued, beginning to walk slowly around the trapped men. Each footstep left a glowing impression in the stone, creating a spiral pattern that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "My mother grew herbs that could heal wounds that wouldn't close, flowers that could ease pain that wouldn't fade. Simple magic, the kind that helps rather than harms. She paused in front of Sister Morgana, studying the woman's face with eyes that held depths of fire. But your order doesn't distinguish between magic that heals and magic that destroys, does it? To you, all supernatural power is corruption that must be purified. Even the ability to grow healing plants is heresy worthy of death. Sister Morgana tried to raise her hand to make a warding gesture, but the metal of her gauntlets had become too hot to bear. She was forced to strip them off, revealing hands blistered and burned by her own protective equipment. My father was a blacksmith, Seraphina said, moving to stand before Brother Aldwin. He made horseshoes and plowshares, tools that helped people build better lives. But he had the gift of making metal sing, of coaxing properties from iron and steel that no normal smith could achieve. Your inquisitors called it demonic influence. Brother Aldwin was pressed against the cathedral wall, his crimson robes dark with sweat. We follow orders, he gasped, his voice barely audible. The high sanctum decides what constitutes corruption. We are just the instruments of divine will. Divine will, Seraphina repeated, and her transformed features showed something that might have been pity. How convenient it must be to blame atrocity on divine mandate. How easy to sleep at night when you convince yourself that murder and torture are acts of holy service. She turned back to Blackwood, who was still attempting to maintain some semblance of authority despite his increasingly desperate situation. My brother was 8 years old when your instruments of divine will cut his throat. 8 years old, and his crime was being able to speak with animals. The village children loved him because he could translate what their pets were thinking, help them understand when their horses were in pain. The temperature in the cathedral had reached the point where the ancient wooden fixtures were beginning to smolder. Wisps of smoke rose from the altar, the pews, the carved confessional booths that had stood for centuries. The very air shimmered with heat distortion, making Seraphina appear to ripple and flow like a mirage. But you want to know the truly magnificent part of your divine mission? Seraphina asked, her voice taking on a quality that seemed to resonate in the stones themselves. My mother wasn't even using magic that night. She was in labor, giving birth to me under the crimson stars. She couldn't have cast a spell if her life had depended on it. She gestured toward the pile of melted weapons scattered across the cathedral floor. Your predecessors burned down half the village, looking for evidence of demonic corruption. They tortured confession out of anyone who admitted to owning one of my mother's healing potions. They found exactly what they always find, the confirmation of guilt they brought with them. Blackwood's blessed sword was now glowing white-hot in his hand, the divine protection that should have shielded him from supernatural influence, proving utterly useless against the forces Seraphina commanded. With a cry of pain, he was forced to drop the weapon, which struck the stone floor and began to melt into slag. And now, 23 years later, here you stand in another sacred place, ready to perform another purification, Seraphina said, her transformed features terrible in their beauty. How many villages have you burned in the name of your divine mandate? How many families have you destroyed to protect the faithful from imaginary corruption? She raised her hand, and the temperature in the cathedral spiked dramatically. The wooden pews burst into flame simultaneously, filling the space with roaring fire and billowing smoke. But the flames seemed to bend away from Seraphina, creating a clear circle around her transformed form. The difference is, she continued, her voice cutting through the crackling of burning wood, this time you're facing someone who actually possesses the power you've spent your lives claiming to fight. This time, your victims can fight back. Sister Morgana collapsed to her knees, overcome by the heat and smoke. Brother Aldwin was pressed against the wall, gasping for breath that seemed to burn his lungs. Only Blackwood remained standing, his years of experience and iron will keeping him upright, despite the impossible circumstances. What do you want? He demanded, his voice cracked and hoarse. Revenge? The satisfaction of proving your superior power? Or do you simply want to watch us burn like we burned your family? Seraphina's smile was like sunrise reflected in a blade, beautiful, terrible and absolutely final. I want you to understand, she said, what it feels like to be helpless in the face of absolute power. I want you to experience the terror of knowing that your life depends entirely on the mercy of someone you've wronged beyond forgiveness. She took a step closer and the stone beneath her feet began to glow like a coal fresh from the forge. And then I want you to carry that understanding back to your order, assuming any of you survive to make the journey. The cathedral had become a vision of supernatural justice that would haunt the survivors' nightmares for the rest of their lives. Flames danced across every wooden surface, yet the fire seemed controlled, directed, held back from complete destruction by Seraphina's will alone. The ancient stones glowed with residual heat from her footsteps, creating patterns of light that pulsed like a vast heartbeat. In the center of this controlled inferno stood a woman who had transcended the limitations of mortal flesh, her metallic skin reflecting the firelight like a mirror forged in heaven's own furnace. Inquisitor Blackwood found himself in a position he had never imagined possible, completely at the mercy of someone he had spent months hunting like a rabid animal. His weapons were useless slag cooling on the superheated stone. His blessed armor had become a torture device that burned his skin with every breath. His subordinates were either fled or collapsed, leaving him alone to face judgment from someone whose power made a mockery of everything he had been taught to believe. "Look around you," Seraphina said, her transformed voice carrying easily through the roar of controlled flames. "This is what power actually looks like when it's unleashed without restraint. Not the careful application of blessed weapons, or the methodical burning of defenseless villages. This is what you've spent your career claiming to fight." She gestured toward the burning pews, the glowing walls, the very air that shimmered with supernatural heat. "And yet, despite having the ability to reduce you to ash in an instant, despite every reason to kill you for the crimes you've committed, I find myself hesitating. Do you know why?" Blackwood tried to speak but found his throat too dry, his lungs too seared by the superheated air. He could only shake his head, a gesture that sent drops of sweat sizzling against the heated stone at his feet. "Because I am not like you," Seraphina said, her metallic features showing something that might have been regret. "Because despite everything your order has done to me, to my family, to countless innocent people across the realm, I still retain the capacity for mercy. I can still choose to be better than my enemies." She began to walk toward him, her footsteps leaving glowing impressions that would probably remain visible for centuries. "My mother's final gift wasn't just the transformation of my flesh. She also gave me the wisdom to understand the difference between justice and vengeance, between righteous anger and mindless destruction." The flames around the cathedral began to subside slightly, though the heat remained oppressive. Sister Morgana managed to lift her head from where she had collapsed, her face streaked with tears that evaporated almost instantly in the dry air. Brother Aldwin remained pressed against the wall, his eyes wide with terror and awe. 23 years ago, your order had a choice," Seraphina continued, stopping just out of arm's reach from Blackwood. "They could have investigated the reports of supernatural activity in Ravenshallow. They could have spoken with the villagers, examined the evidence, determined whether any actual threat existed. Instead they chose to assume guilt and act accordingly." She raised her hand, and Blackwood flinched, expecting some form of supernatural attack. Instead she simply examined her transformed fingers, watching how the metallic surface caught and reflected the firelight. "Tonight I face the same choice," she said. "I could kill you all and justify it as righteous vengeance for crimes committed. I could reduce this cathedral to molten stone and claim it was divine justice for the innocent blood your order has spilled. And unlike you, I actually have the power to carry out such threats." The temperature in the cathedral began to drop noticeably, though it remained far above what should have been comfortable for unprotected humans. The flames on the wooden fixtures flickered and dimmed, though they didn't go out entirely. "But I choose differently," Seraphina said, her voice taking on a tone of absolute finality. "Not because you deserve mercy, but because I refuse to become the monster you've always claimed I was. I will not let your crimes transform me into something as pitiless and cruel as the order itself." She turned away from Blackwood and walked toward the cathedral's sealed entrance. Where her hands touched the ancient doors, the metal hinges and locks began to glow red-hot, then white-hot, then simply melted away entirely. The massive portals swung open, revealing the cold night air and the freedom that lay beyond. "Go," she commanded, her back still turned to the surviving inquisitors. "Return to your high sanctum, tell them what you've witnessed here tonight." Explain to them that their crusade against supernatural abilities has awakened something they cannot hope to control or defeat. Brother Aldwin was the first to move, stumbling toward the open doors with desperate haste. Sister Morgana followed more slowly, her burns making movement painful. Only Blackwood remained, staring at Seraphina's transformed figure with something approaching wonder. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything we've done, everything we represent, why spare us?" Seraphina turned back to face him one final time, her metallic features beautiful and terrible in the dying firelight. "Because someone has to break the cycle," she said. "Someone has to choose mercy over vengeance, understanding over hatred. If it's not me, then who?" She gestured toward the open doors. "But understand this, Inquisitor Blackwood, this is the only mercy you will receive from me. If the Order continues its persecution of innocent people, if it burns more villages or murders more children in the name of divine will, I will find you. And next time, I will not be so generous." Blackwood nodded slowly, understanding the weight of the reprieve he had been given. He turned and walked toward the cathedral entrance, his footsteps echoing through the vast space. At the threshold, he paused and looked back one final time. "The Order will never stop," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "They'll see what happened here as proof that their crusade is necessary. They'll double their efforts, increase their vigilance." Seraphina's smile was sad and knowing. "Let them try," she said. "I am no longer hiding, no longer pretending to be something weak and human. If they want a war against the supernatural, I'll give them one they'll never forget." As the last of the Inquisitors disappeared into the night, Seraphina stood alone in the cathedral that had witnessed her transformation. The fires were dying now, the temperature slowly returning to normal, though the glowing footprints in the stone would remain as permanent testament to what had occurred. She looked down at her transformed hands, at the metallic skin that was both her mother's final gift and her own birthright. The Iron Maiden was gone forever, replaced by something far more dangerous and beautiful. The hunt was over. But the real story was just beginning. 3 weeks after the confrontation at the Cathedral of Forgotten Saints, Seraphina stood on a windswept cliff overlooking the trading city of Golden Haven. The morning sun reflected off her transformed skin like light dancing on polished steel, creating an aura of radiance that would have been beautiful if not for the terrible purpose that brought her to this place. In the distance, smoke rose from the city's market quarter, the unmistakable sign of another purification in progress. The Order of the Crimson Veil had not heeded the warning delivered by the surviving Inquisitors. If anything, Blackwood's report of her transformation had only intensified their efforts to root out supernatural corruption throughout the realm. The High Sanctum had declared a state of holy immersion, mobilizing every available resource in what they now called the Final Purification, a campaign designed to eliminate all traces of unnatural ability from the world. Seraphina had spent the intervening weeks learning to master her mother's gift, discovering capabilities that went far beyond the metallic skin and resistance to heat she had initially. Her transformed body could reshape itself at will, hardening to turn aside the sharpest blades or becoming fluid enough to slip through the smallest spaces. She could generate temperatures hot enough to melt stone, or focus her internal fire into beams of energy that could strike targets from impossible distances. But power without purpose was mere destruction, and Seraphina had chosen a purpose that would reshape the balance of forces across the continent. She would no longer hide from the Order's persecution or limit herself to defensive actions. If they wanted a war against the supernatural, she would give them exactly what they demanded, but not in the way they expected. The smoke rising from Golden Haven told the story of another family destroyed, another group of innocent people branded as heretics and eliminated for the crime of being different. According to her network of informants, refugees and survivors who had begun to seek her out, the latest victims had been a young couple whose only supernatural ability was the power to purify water. They had used their gift to help the poor, cleaning contaminated wells and making disease-ridden water safe to drink. Their reward had been denunciation by a neighbor seeking to claim their property. Seraphina began her descent toward the city, her footsteps leaving glowing marks in the rocky cliff face. She moved with fluid grace despite her transformed nature,
each step calculated and precise. The time for hiding was over, the time for mercy had passed. If the Order wanted to escalate their persecution, she would show them what true escalation looked like. The market quarter was in chaos when she arrived, with civilians fleeing in all directions while inquisitors in crimson robes conducted their methodical search for additional corruption. Buildings burned with the characteristic green flame that marked the use of purification fire, a supernatural blaze that consumed not just physical matter, but any trace of magical residue. Serafina walked calmly through the chaos, her transformed appearance drawing stares of terror and wonder from those brave enough to look directly at her. The heat radiating from her body was enough to stop the purification fires in their tracks. The supernatural flames simply couldn't maintain their hold in the presence of power that vastly exceeded their own. The first inquisitor to notice her presence was a young man barely out of his training, his blessed sword shaking in his grip as he tried to process what he was seeing. "Demon!" he screamed, raising his weapon and charging toward her with more courage than sense. Serafina didn't even slow down. She reached out with one metallic hand and caught the blessed blade between her fingers, the consecrated steel melting like ice cream on a summer day. The Inquisitor stared at the ruined weapon in shock, then turned and fled screaming into the crowd. Word of her presence spread through the market quarter faster than the purification fires themselves. Within minutes, every Inquisitor in the district was converging on her position, their crimson robes creating a tide of color against the smoky backdrop. They came with blessed weapons, purification rituals and absolute certainty in their divine mandate. They died with screams on their lips and terror in their hearts. Serafina moved through their ranks like a living force of nature, her transformed body deflecting their attacks, while her own power reduced their weapons and armor to molten slag. She didn't kill them all, some she left alive to carry word back to their superiors, their minds broken by witnessing power that made a mockery of everything they believed. When the massacre was over, she stood in the center of the market square surrounded by the cooling remains of blessed weapons and the unconscious forms of those inquisitors she had chosen to spare. The purification fires had been extinguished, the surviving civilians were emerging from hiding, and the smoke rising from the district now carried a very different message. "Let this be the beginning," Serafina said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "For too long those with supernatural gifts have lived in fear, hiding their abilities and pretending to be normal. No more. The age of persecution is ending." She looked directly at the crowd of survivors, her transformed features terrible and beautiful in the morning light. "Spread the word across the realm. Tell everyone who has ever felt the touch of power, everyone who has ever been forced to hide their true nature. The Iron Maiden is dead, but something far greater has taken her place." She began to walk toward the city's main gates, her footsteps leaving glowing impressions in the cobblestones. "Tell them that Serafina Blackthorn has returned, and she is gathering an army. Not of conquest, not of vengeance, but of liberation. The Order wants a war against the supernatural, they shall have it." As she reached the gates, she turned back one final time to address the crowd that had gathered to watch her departure. "But this time," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "we will not be the ones who run and hide. This time, they will learn what it means to be hunted." The transformation was complete, not just of her body, but of her purpose. The frightened woman who had hidden behind obsidian armor was gone forever, replaced by something that would reshape the very foundations of the world. The Order of the Crimson Veil had wanted to strip away her protection, to expose what they believed was weakness beneath. Instead, they had awakened a force that would bring their 1,000-year reign of terror to an end. The real war was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.